is Arif Halaby on your hometown station, AM 1220 KHTS.
Hey, welcome to the show, Total Financial Solutions, Safer Money Hour. I'm Arif Halaby, along with Jeff Gerard, every week at this time, talking about your family's finances, of course, getting out of debt, managing money, planning for your financial future. More importantly, look, a lot of you are entrepreneurs. I've told you my entire life, that's basically what I have focused on as entrepreneurs. In fact, we give our scholarship money to kids that want to become entrepreneurs. We focus and feature them on our radio shows for the last 11 years. That's a big part of who we are and what we do at Total Financial Solutions. And so staying true to that, we are bringing on look, you guys know Apple. I don't even have to say Apple computers or Apple products. In fact, in front of me are 3 of my Apple products. Only because I didn't have enough hands to bring the rest of them to the studio. If you take a look online, you can go to, of course, to hometownstation.com and stream watching what we are doing in studio and, of course, listening live. You can also go to Time Warner and hit the cable station, Channel 20, and see our shows, of course, as we tape them. Look, Apple Computers has been a stalwart, and many people know Steve Jobs as the founder, but sometimes the visionary, the person who builds that concept, is not always the one who can continue to implement it, and that is not an insult to anybody. That just says people have different skill sets, and then through that process, Mr. Sculley, John Sculley, has come along and became part of Apple Computer, and before that was part of PepsiCo. Pepsi, we want to talk a little bit about that as well. He has a book out, and we're going to talk about his book. It's called Moonshot. What that title is all about, I'm going to have him explain it to you. Welcome to the show, John Sculley. How are you, sir?
Thank you, Aris. Nice to be with you, and Jeff, you as well.
Thank you.
You know, one of the things that we wanted to talk about, John, is in your life as a almost somebody who has witnessed history, at least in the business world. The transition in the last 30, maybe 40 years that you have seen has been quite incredible.
It really has. And I remember when I first met Steve Jobs, which was back in 1982, and I didn't know much about personal computers, though I actually was using an Apple II at that time. But it was a pretty small, unknown industry in a strange place called Silicon Valley that most people in the world had never heard of. And Steve Jobs and Bill Gates both had a very big vision that they believed they were going to change the world. And I was quizzical, if not skeptical, when I first met them and heard that. But obviously we know they were incredibly prescient, and they really did see the future, and it did happen.
Yeah, you know, one of the most amazing things to me is how somebody can see something that ceases to even be in existence today. You know, in other words, this has not even been a concept like you're making a better mousetrap, where a mousetrap even existed before. Steve Jobs, and part of that process, if you will, was something that said, we're going to create something that doesn't even exist yet, turn it into something, and create, if you will, an entirely new industry. You see that today where a lot of people have come along. What do you see as the main impact of your time at Apple Computer on technology today?
Well, I'll talk about that in a moment, but I just want to pick up on that last observation you made and tell you a very quick story that I remember when Steve Jobs and I went up to visit Dr. Land. Dr. Land was the founder of Polaroid, and he'd been pushed out of his company, and he had set up his own laboratory along the Charles River in Boston. And Steve and I went to see him because Steve was a big admirer of Dr. Land. And we were sitting there in this big conference room. Dr. Land and Steve were talking. I was kind of the witness in the room. And they were talking about how new products are created. And Dr. Land said, I don't really create products. They exist all the time. I discover them. They're invisible. They're just waiting to be revealed. And Steve Jobs said, that's how I think about it as well. He said, people laugh at me because I refuse to do any consumer research. He said, but how can I go out and ask people what they think about something that they have no experience with what it is prior to me creating it? So in the case of both of them, they really said that the products that they created, Dr. Land, the Polaroid camera, Steve Jobs, a whole string of successful Apple products, but they said that they really saw their role as looking at what does humankind need, because technology can basically solve any problem once it focuses on what the problem is. And I soon learned after I joined Apple, Aris, that I was sitting around with Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. It was late one evening in the Macintosh labs, and Steve and Bill, who rarely agreed on anything specifically, were totally in alignment over the vision that they had about how personal computers were going to change the world. And they put it in the context of what they called a noble cause. And that's a really good piece of advice to entrepreneurs, that it isn't just about how do you make money. It's about how do you solve really big, important problems for customers and even for humankind.
Well, John, how do you know that you're noble? How do you know that your cause is one that's noble? Because we see this a lot where something like Google Glass came out and folks said, you know what, we're not willing to do that just yet. Or another noble cause might be trying to solve a problem that is difficult to get people on board. How do you know you have a noble cause? Well,
the honest answer is in most cases you don't have a noble cause, because most new companies aren't successful. You have to be a risk taker. You have to be willing to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and try again. So in the case of the personal computer, the timing was perfect. The technology was just getting affordable and powerful enough that you actually could create a tool for the mind, as Steve Jobs used to refer to the personal computer. And you could create something for knowledge workers, an idea that had been around for decades, started by Peter Drucker, but nobody could build one. And they said, we can change the world by giving ordinary people these incredibly great tools for the mind and change the world one person at a time. So that was a huge noble cause. But you're right. When people come out with something like Google Glass, it's not that Google Glass is a bad idea. It just may be too premature to introduce it. It may not be clear enough exactly what it was designed to solve, exactly what problem. But it may not be a noble cause in the case of Google Glass, but it may well be an important accessory to other things that are going to come along to enable people to collaborate and to be more productive over time. But it just may be quite a few years too early.
Do you think people take a step? Do you think sometimes people take 3 or 4 or 5 steps at a time instead of that 1 or 2 steps that are necessary? I'm going to let you think about it, John. We're going to come back, take a break real quick. We'll be right back. I'm Arif Halaby on Total Financial Solutions Safer Money Hour, along with Jeff Gerard and special guest John Sculley, the author of Moonshot. What is that all about? John Sculley, former CEO of Apple Computers, when we come right back on AM 1220 KHTS. Welcome back to the show. Total Financial Solutions, Safer Money Hour. Arif Halaby and Jeff Gerard on your place for news, talk, and information. Special guest this hour, folks, John Sculley, author of Moonshot. You need to go out and buy that book. In fact, I've put it on my Apple devices, quite ironic, I guess, and read it on my mini iPad almost nonstop in the last 48 hours. An amazing book and an opportunity, folks, for you to learn a little bit about what it takes to create a billion-dollar business. I don't know, John, if you know this answer, because Jeff and I were talking about this earlier today. We were thinking how many businesses in the last 8 or 10 years, within a decade or even less, have gone from an idea in somebody's dorm room to a billion-dollar business. Any idea of how many of these companies have created? John, you there? Oops, let's see if we can pull you up. John Sculley. We'll pull him back up here in just a second. Folks, one of the things we're talking about is in your financial life, what does it take to create a business? We've talked about entrepreneurship for quite some time. That entrepreneurship allows you to get out of the 9 to 5, which sometimes means you're going to work more hours, but it puts you into control, into your financial life. Look, Jeff, how many times have people gone to work, think they had a secure job, and before you know it, it's not secure?
That's right. And, we've talked about this, whether you separate from a company by default or by design, sometimes that timing is not what you think it's going to be. How many stories have we heard where someone was just trying to find, turn a hobby or something that they thought they were really good at and passionate about. They were turning that into a means to replace their income. They go to their day job, they do what they're, semi-good at and what's paying the bills, but in the background, they're building this business and they're hoping that it can one day be the thing that actually propels them through life financially and not this job that they hope to leave one day.
Entrepreneurship has always been something that I think has made America great. That's why people come here.
Yes.
Take a look around, Jeff. You've seen people sleep in the back of donut shops or nail salons or liquor stores, and within a few years they own the place.
That's right.
And yet there are some Americans for generations after generations that can't get off government assistance. For whatever reason, you see that there's this culture of poverty, and in some cultures there's a culture of entrepreneurism, and I think that's what America makes it great. John Sculley, do we have you back?
I'm right here. Yes, can you hear me?
All right. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, we lost you there for a second. John, one of the things we were talking about just before the break is the amount of businesses, if you will, that take 2 and 3 steps forward, and sometimes they go too far ahead. The consumer has not caught up yet, and that's one thing. But the other question, Jeff and I were talking about it, I thought of it during the break. How many companies just in the last few years have become billion-dollar businesses where 5 and 10 years ago they were somebody's idea in a garage? It seems like this is the time when the old gold rush, if you will, is happening.
I would say well over 100, and the number may be higher than that.
Wow.
And the reason why the number is larger than you might suspect is that many of these companies were created with very little original capital investment because they were able to take advantage of something I talk about in Moonshot, which is this incredible power shift that's already happened. This is not talking about the future. It's already happened, and it's in process right now. And that is the cloud, mobility, big data analytics. These are big themes in high technology that are growing at incredible rates of expansion, that these technologies have shifted the market power from large incumbent companies to customers who are now paying more attention as to the opinions of other customers than they are to the traditional incumbents. And because of things like social media, the word gets out because customers tell other customers and they tell other customers, and these businesses scale, many of them not even using much, if any, advertising to be able to get their messages out, and they get to large numbers of people. And it's basically solving big customer problems, taking the friction out of business, the inefficiencies. A perfect example would be Uber. I think most people are familiar with the company that has been able to go in and reinvent the taxi industry, and it solved a big problem. There weren't enough taxis when you want them, where you want to go, at any time of day. And Uber came up with a different model where you can get one right away on your smartphone, and it's been an overwhelming success. Now has a value of about $45 billion.
Amazing.
That's just one of the examples.
John, it's incredible. Probably being part of your life, some of these businesses and ideas were those that were consumed, if you will, both when you were at Pepsi. I know that Coke's acquisitions of various products along the way is one of the things that helped it grow. Pepsi did the same thing, and under your tutelage, if you will, at Pepsi, did you also see the acquisition of other brands as a way to expand Pepsi? And there's a reason I ask that, because in technology it seems that way as well.
Sure. I mean, acquisitions is part of the toolkit. But we also created brands. When I was at Pepsi, we created a brand called Mountain Dew. It took us about 7 years to create that into a major national brand in the United States. And today, because of social media, the ability for people to communicate quickly over all kinds of different devices and services, big brands are being built in much, much less time, typically, 18 months to 2 years.
Yeah, I know that one of the things that technology companies do, Apple, Yahoo, Google, is they go out and acquire some of what they see as ideas and problems that were solved where the customer is in control. And in your book, Moonshot, you talk about customers are now in control, not companies. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I'll give you some real examples. So stories about things that really happened, I think, really hit the points home. For example, do you know that 3 years ago that people were questioning whether Facebook had a future? And they said that
I remember
the population that uses Facebook was too old and that young people were going to new kinds of text-based services instead. And at that time, Facebook had almost no revenue, like zero, coming from mobile devices and mobile services. Well, guess what? Today, Facebook gets 70% of its revenue from something that wasn't even in 3 years ago. And you say, well, how is that possible? Well, they went out and acquired a company called WhatsApp. They paid $20 billion for a company with no revenue, but it had 560 million users. And that company has been a great source of what's called lead generation, of generating new customers for Facebook.
Yeah.
They went out and acquired another company called Instagram. That's been another major success. And they started to build mobile video technology that enables mobile video now to be a major source of growth for Facebook. So there's an example of how a company that had been successful was worried about being outmaneuvered by new incumbents, and all of a sudden they come along to a combination of acquisition and innovation internally and reinvent themselves. And that's what it's like to build these multi-billion-dollar companies in the era we live in.
And John, you mentioned in your book Moonshot about how today's innovators really have to be involved in business of multiple layers. In other words, not just somebody with a lot of money sitting on the sideline, but they have to have vision. I can imagine that many ideas have come across your desk, both at Apple and even prior to that, but focusing on technology for a minute. Can you tell me one or two of these ideas that you wish you would have jumped on? I don't know, maybe something you said, we had an opportunity to do this, we passed, down the road came another company that picked it up.
Well, let me start by telling you some that I saw at the beginning that became household names. For example, I remember after we launched desktop publishing in the mid-1980s, a little company called Forethought came to us at Apple, and they said, we have a new idea, and we'd like you to invest in it. And we did. And the product they came up with was called PowerPoint.
Wow.
And we invested in PowerPoint company at the time when its valuation was about $5 million.
Oh, my gosh.
The company was later sold to Microsoft, and I would estimate its value today is probably $70 to $80 billion. So, sometimes you actually do see these things when they're at a very early stage.
Can you
I'm involved.
Can you guess that, John, when you're in the middle of that? Can you look at this and say, this is going to be big?
Sometimes, and sometimes you guess wrong.
Yeah.
For example, I was involved with the development of a product at Apple called Newton. We were convinced that there was a future beyond personal computers for handheld devices, that you'd be able to use gestures and graphics, and you'd be able to communicate wirelessly. The problem was when we introduced it back in 1993, there was no World Wide Web. There were no digital cell phones. There was no way to communicate wirelessly data at that time. So we were way too far ahead of our time. On the other hand, we co-developed the microprocessor called ARM, which is used today in 8 billion cell phones. So there were many key things that came out of Newton, not only the microprocessor, but a lot of the intellectual property for what we know as smartphones today. And we were doing it, unfortunately, probably 17 years, 15 years ahead of the market, and we were just too early. When the web came out and digital cell phones and the cost of technology became less expensive, in the mid-2000s, the smartphone came along, and the rest of that story. And Apple in particular had a huge success with the launch of the iPhone.
It's funny when you see some of the challenges back and forth where people will go, Apple or Android or Apple. One of the times I think will come when we have to make a decision as to what platform we're going to be on, and the distance between those is either going to be really far or really close together. And we're seeing some of that. I thought that was the case for quite a while. But now we're seeing some integration between some of the Android apps and some of the Apple programs and the apps out there as well, where if a company develops something, an app, they don't develop it for just one platform. It's profitable to go into both directions.
Sure, and that's absolutely right. And the tools to be able to port an app from one platform to the other are becoming better and cheaper and easier to use. So for all the reasons that you pointed out, the technology is commoditizing. To give you a good example of that, there are 7 billion people on the planet, and only about 2 billion of the 7 billion are actually connected to the Internet. And so you say, well, how do we get the rest of them? So I'm just in the process of introducing a new company, which will launch in Silicon Valley in the third week of August. And it's not a company where we're going to sell products in the United States. It's for it's for countries, particularly in the developing markets, where people cannot afford the prices that they pay for a smartphone in the U.S. but where they have aspirations to be able to have a smartphone. And so we are designing in Silicon Valley products called OB World Phone, which will be far, far cheaper than any of the smartphones that are sold in the U.S. And we're reaching out to a very specific market. These first-time adopters of countries where half the population may be 25 years or under, and where they want smartphones too, but they just don't have the kind of big bucks that people are required to spend in order to get the major leading brands of smartphones in the U.S. and Europe.
John, a lot of companies are trying to cater to the top end of the economy, but they're missing and forgetting the fact that in the big scale picture here, most of the world can. Look, we talk about, you can go down the street and see a lot of the day laborers and a lot of the folks that are working on the side of the road or hoping to get a job, and they're from usually Central or South America. They always have a smartphone. They're sitting there waiting to work on a day's wages, and they're checking their cell phones. Mm-hmm. I don't care who you are. Cell phones still cost money, but the internet is free.
I was, a few months ago in Kenya, in Tanzania, and we were just launching our products over there. And the president of Tanzania said to me, he said, John, in our country, we have very little infrastructure. We don't even have consumer banking infrastructure. And the way we think of it is you've got to have water, you've got to have food, and you've got to have a smartphone. It's fundamental to the ladder to life, to a better way of living, for your health, for your ability to move money around. For instance, in Kenya, 45% of the GDP, the gross domestic product of Kenya, goes over the smartphone, what's called M-Pesa, which is
I know it well.
To make payments and move money from one individual to another, because there's no consumer banking system there.
5 years ago, look, John.
We kind of take these things for granted, but in other parts of the world, the smartphone is a crucial part of changing people's lives.
5 years ago, I was part of a mastermind group for a few years, and one of the ladies in there, her name is Wandia, is from Kenya. Young lady who sold her first company in her mid-20s to Google, I believe, and was just brilliant. And she's from Kenya. And she said, one of the things that I don't understand about the United States yet is why they're not embracing mobile technology. I'm going back 5 years. It could be longer. And she was talking about some of the things that Kenya was doing. And I was shocked, because we don't understand that the rest of the world can be, in some cases, so much more advanced, especially in inner China. China never built telephone poles. They went straight to cell towers. They don't have to go one step, two steps. They jumped over this hardwire, copper wire telephone system and went straight to cell phone towers. That is a big change. When we come back, I'm going to get to some more. And ask John Sculley, the disruptions in healthcare, big in the news lately. His book is Moonshot. Definitely a read if you want to be an entrepreneur, if you are an entrepreneur, if you're somebody who wants to create a business that it succeeds, especially in today's technology. Moonshot. Author is John Sculley, our guest on Total Financial Solutions Safe for Money Hour. I'm Arif Halaby. We'll be right back.